Aaron's research focuses on transboundary water resources issues, conflict resolution, and cooperation between entities and institutions. He has background in environmental science, and he has expertise in conflict resolution and dispute resolution theory. He has served as a consultant to the U.S. Department of State, U.S. Agency for International Aid, the World Bank, and several other governments. And he has made significant contributions to the field of water resources. He has authored a number of very influential books. I know one of them, that's the one on the Jordan River. It's called Hydropolitics Along the Jordan River. I hope I got the title right. But he has also many other influential books. And without any further ado, let me invite our speaker, Professor Aaron Wolf.
Being invited to be a scholar in residence on water at Irvine is, it's Coles to Newcastle. Some of the best water people in the world are here. And so it's a real pleasure to be here and be part of it. Just get a sense of who's in the room, who's faculty. Students? Students who are here for extra credit? Okay, I got it, okay. These are the guys that are going to be sneaking out as soon as they can. I get it. And that's fine. Of the people, how many people consider themselves water people? Okay, and of the water people, how many of you consider yourselves primarily on the technical side? And how many on the social sciences side? And how many consider themselves really, really well trained in both? The guy. Okay, awesome. Okay, so this is exactly where we start. I'll talk a little bit about kind of how I got to where I got. Of the words that are up here, which word kind of jumps out? You go, what? Go ahead, say it. Enlightenment. Yes, enlightenment. Really? Okay. So you're wondering what that has to do with other words that jump out. Yeah, spirituality, right? What on earth is enlightenment? What does spirituality have to do with water resources? And we'll get there kind of as a process. My original training is as a scientist. I was a groundwater flow modeler. I worked for a federal agency that I won't name, but that surveyed geology. How's that? For a number of years, and found that science was really, really important, but not the entire story. And so when we look at water resources that are shared, we right away end up with a kind of a discordant set of views. On the left, what we see is the watershed the way water people see the world. By boundaries, by basins, but all the things within this boundary, they're all connected to each other. Groundwater, surface water, quality, quantity, everything's connected. And so water people see this, and they see this new, the legislation that's being attacked now, whether navigable waterways include wetlands, include little streams. Water people are going, of course they do. You can't dump a bunch of crap in a wetland and not expect it to end up in the navigable waterway. But the rest of the world doesn't see, as we found out, doesn't necessarily see the world the same way. The way that a lot of the world sees the world is with the political boundaries or with the sectoral boundaries or with the things that divide us. So this kind of clash of views is the first thing you find when you're working in shared water resources. Those boundaries are there for very legitimate reasons. You can't just say, water people would love to be able to say, just ignore the boundaries. Well, you can't. Which way of looking at the world is right? Both. Both, thank you. You're the guy. Okay. Absolutely, they're both right. And that's exactly our problem, is as water resource people, we have to manage the water as if the world looked this way, recognizing full well that these boundaries are there, they're not going anywhere, and we need to acknowledge that they're there for very legitimate reasons, either between countries or between states or between economic sectors or between peoples. When I started, and this was years ago, when I first met Sarush and first met Richard back in the mid-90s, the talk was about water wars on the horizon. A number of people said, including the vice president of the World Bank, the wars of the 21st century will be about water resources. And these were the 6 cases that they kind of held up and say, look, people share watersheds across very hostile boundaries. And look who shares basins. We've got the Jordan River between Arabs and Israelis. They get along really well, so there are no problems there. India and Pakistan, the same thing. Central Asia. The Nile Basin shared at the time between 10 and now between 11 different countries. And so the problem is, how do you share water across these very, very hostile boundaries? And people would look at this without a lot of nuance and a lot of training and say, naturally, here's a resource that we rely on for everything we do, shared across very hostile boundaries. Therefore, the wars of the 21st century will be about water resources. How many people agree? A couple of people do. A couple of people do. And this is despite 20 years of Richard Matthews and me and Jeff DeBelko, a number of, all of the UNESCO, IHE with their PCCP program. There's a rich history now of documenting that, yes, these 6 cases brought about tension, but interestingly, they never ended up in political violence or in military violence. And each of these cases that are being held up as kind of the example of conflict also end up being the tremendous examples of how people across divides end up talking to each other. So what we started to do, again, my original training is as a scientist, as somebody who counts something. And so what we started to count, we said, okay, these 6 cases are being held up as examples of why the world's going to go to war in the 21st century. My question as a scientist is, how do we know? On what evidence are these projections based? What are the assumptions going into it? And so we simply started to count. The first thing we started to count was how many watersheds there are. It's more than 6. This map took 3 years to make. To figure out now there's 310 transboundary watersheds, covering half the land surface of the Earth. 2/3 of the world's water originates in basins that are shared by 2 or more countries. Any geographers, cartographers? They're not owning up. I see you way in the back. Okay. So are you a cartographer or geographer? You work with ArcGIS? Anybody have, I don't want to pick on you because you're way in the back and kind of cowering down at this point, but anybody have any idea why this is such a difficult map to make? Nowadays, with everything digitized, the topography is digitized and the basins are digitized. You should just be able to superimpose one on the other and find all the transboundary basins. Why is this difficult? Yeah?
All the data is within nation states?
No, the topography is actually, there's a global data set of topography. The USGS has it, and it's all available for the entire world. That's a good guess. Anybody else? Yeah. So groundwater, only shallow groundwater. These are surface water basins. And so the aquifers we don't touch. UNESCO there's a program called IGRAC that just counted. There's another 600 shared groundwater aquifers that don't even show up on this map. That's also a good guess. Anybody else? Yeah. Sorry? Everything changes. That's part of the problem, and we'll see how that becomes problematic. The basic problem is digital data is good when the topography is like this, but if you think a lot of basins, the topography is more like this. So the map was us using a combination of digital data and spreading on the floor of the cartography department big topo sheets, World War II Department of Defense topo sheets, to get this. So the lesson, especially to the students here, don't just rely on digital data. A lot of ground truthing is needed to find out what's actually going on. All right, we continued to count. We started to count instances of countries, what they did with each other. Did they cooperate? Did they conflict? We have the largest collection of water treaties anywhere in the world at Oregon State. Negotiating notes. When people end up with problems around water, what are the problems? How do they negotiate them? Indigenous methods of conflict resolution. What we wanted to do was get a much more holistic sense of how people actually conflict and cooperate. And here's your ArcGIS. This is back in the day. Put it all into a GIS map so you could start to look at data coming together. We also went back over 60 years and looked at every instance of 2 countries doing anything over water and compiled it along a spectrum of conflict and cooperation. So anytime, here's India and Bangladesh on the top line, Bangladesh lodged a formal protest. So we capture what the issue is, where it is on a spectrum of conflict and cooperation. And simply by doing that, we captured 1,800 instances of countries doing something over water. And right off the bat, this is probably the most cited of the work that we've done. This is already, 10 years or more, 10 years old. But the trends have continued. If we look at this spectrum from cooperation to conflict, 2/3 of the time we do anything over water, it's cooperate. This wasn't being mentioned in the press. It's not in the proclamations about war. 2/3, and each of those 6 cases, as I said, not only had they had tensions develop between them, but then they had sat down and resolved their issues. They had signed treaties. They had come to working arrangements and memoranda of understanding. On the conflict side, 80% of conflict is verbal conflict. Okay? This means somebody says, we're going to go to war. Okay? Who usually says that? The politicians. And who are they talking about? Who are they talking to when a politician says, we're going to war? Are they even talking to the neighbor? More often than not, who are they talking to? To their own constituents, exactly right. And what do they mean by we're going to war? Vote for me in November. Right? So you have politicians saying, we're going to go to war to protect the lifeblood of the nation. And who else is really interested in making sure the conflict story gets out? Media, right? The fake media. Whoever it is, right? They're out there. They're out there, and for good reason, right? The conflict is the thing that sells. And what's really interesting, I'll sit for an hour, I know a number of my colleagues here do the same thing, with a journalist and say, isn't it amazing? Arabs and Israelis have cooperated. Indians and Pakistanis have cooperated. There's this miracle liquid that brings people together in dialogue and harmony. And what's the headline the next day? Water wars on the horizon, right? Absolutely no matter what. So this is journalists writing about conflict and politicians talking about it. And this is actual violence. Over 60 years, 38 cases between countries, 38 cases of shots being fired, armies being mobilized. 28 of these are between Israelis and Arabs. And what's interesting there is that the last shot fired specifically about water on the Jordan Basin was in 1970. So those who know the region, they ran out of water. Demand hit supply in 1968. Last shot fired was in 1970. In all the intervening years, a couple of wars, 2 intifadas, all kinds of hostility and all kinds of threats and power relations and all kinds of dynamics going on, and 0 violent conflict over water resources. Here's the number of wars in the last 60 years over water. 0. You have to go back 4,500 years to find the only documented case of a war between 2 countries. In this case, the city-states of Lagash and Umma went to war in 2500 BCE on a tributary of the Tigris River, which immediately resulted in the first water treaty being signed between the city-states of Lagash and Umma. So this is our record. Our record is we get along. I'm from Northern California. I'm in Southern California. I'm testament to the fact that we can get along despite our water conflicts. Okay, we then started to look at doing early warning, right? People who were interested in these kinds of things came to us and said, we get there aren't going to be wars, right? But yet it does result in tensions. It does result in threats. It does result in all kinds of unappealing scenarios. Help us determine, help us figure out quantifiable indicators for looking at water conflict into the future. And what we ended up doing, I won't bore you again, this was another 3-year study, a lot of data, a lot of statistics, to basically find that there are 3 things you look for to be able to find a water conflict in the future. One is somebody's going to build something and there's no agreement for what to do about it. So somebody's going to build a dam and there's no treaty for the impacts of the dam. Okay? If somebody builds a dam, we have 4 dams, the US and Canada. We have 4 dams that we built together under a treaty. There's not going to be a conflict over any of those dams. In contrast, Ethiopia is building a dam that up until recently had no agreement with Egypt, and there was absolutely conflict over that. So it's not the dam that causes the conflict, it's the dam in the absence of an agreement. The other thing is international basins, internationalized basins. Where's our historians? Poli-sci? Nobody's raising their hand anymore. I'm getting the sense of the dynamic here. All right, so what's an internationalized basin? Think about all the basins, the 6 case studies I started off with. Indus, Jordan, Nile, Tigris, Euphrates, all have something in common historically. What were they? Nile, Jordan. Say again? Say again? Also, but later, when I say historically, I meant last 100 years. But yes. Say again? Colonial, who precisely? Who precisely? They're all Brits. They all developed their water institution under the British Empire when it was all one unit. So the first Nile Basin Agreement, 1929, was signed between the British Foreign Office in Cairo and the British Foreign Office in Addis Ababa. They signed the treaty together, right? So when then the empire falls apart, now you've got internationalized basins, and now you've got basins where the institution was crafted under one regime, and now there are multiple, right? So this is problematic for the regime as a whole. And now the ones currently in conflict, if I tell you the Caucasus or Central Asia, what do they have in common? Soviet Union, right? Soviet Union. So again, the institutions were crafted, Soviet Union broke apart. And this gets back to your point, ma'am, that the basins, the boundaries change and the number of international basins change. I can't tell you how frustrating it was for me when the Soviet Union broke apart. It's like 20-something new international basins simply because, anyway, they didn't ask me. All right, so now we have a method that's couched both in theory and in practice of identifying basins at risk in the future. And again, this is an old study where these basins aren't at risk anymore, but by comparing things like independence movements, dams in the absence of agreements, you can identify basins at risk. And it's interesting that you're here because when the UN published this was our map of this study, and this was the UN's version. Anybody see the differences? What are the differences? Somebody here said. Yeah, the color scheme is one thing, right? So this is what you call the stoplight scheme in cartography. Reds. UN said, no, we don't have conflict in the UN. That red is too scary. We don't want that. So we're going to change it to, this is called the grapevine scheme, right? So that's one. Anybody see other differences? Take a look at our title. That's our title. That's the UN's title, right? We're all friends. We all get along, right? So anyway, this was done. And with the methodology, it's tried and true. We've been doing this year after year, and we do an early warning map. This was last year's early warning map, where we really can project and help identify places that are going to be tense. So this is half of the story. None of this is what I wanted to talk about tonight, okay? So get back to the issues that kind of raised people's, I don't want to say hackles, but felt out of place. Enlightenment and spirituality. What does this have to do with anything? Half of what I do is this. Big data sets, global data, map making, early warning, all this kind of thing. Here's our lesson from David Gray, who worked at the World Bank for a number of years. Science without policy is science. Policy without science is gambling, right? So if you're going to make projections like the wars are going to be about this and this, start by counting stuff, right? Start by seeing what's there actually in the field and what people's experience actually is. The other half of what I do is this. I'm a facilitator. I'm a mediator. I work in the room. And in the room, the science is great. Again, I was a groundwater flow modeler. I would come across a group of angry people, a lake is disappearing, and I'd say, oh, I've got the solution. Here it is. I've optimized and I've quantified and I have your solution. And what would these angry people do? Absolutely ignore me, right? Absolutely. No, that's not it. We have to fight. Why? In the facilitation world, the saying is the issue's never the issue, right? You start by talking about water. It's not about water. Right? It's about history, it's about ethnicity, it's about language, it's about culture, it's about all these other kinds of things. This happens to be Central Asia, and this is exactly how not to design I was hired to facilitate, but not to design the facilitation. So there was one row of angry Central Asians on one side. There was another row of angry Central Asians on the other side. They screamed at each other for a bunch, and then they would break up and figure out how to obstruct the process. Of course, the one woman in the room is not being consulted at all. And you have all these other angry engineers sitting around being angry. So this is one way to approach conflict. And this is kind of how I was trained. When I started to get interested, when I realized people were a real part of the issue, I went back and got a PhD in policy analysis and in conflict resolution. And the training there is, and most of, how many people here have taken a course in conflict resolution or facilitation? Oh, a lot of people. Okay, good. So most of us probably, speculating, were originally trained in some version of getting to yes, some version of the Harvard model of facilitation, which is a very rational model. It works up in your head. And the idea is you separate the people from the problem and you invent options for mutual gain. It's all kind of quantifiable and mathematical. And then you walk into a room like this and you go, oh, no, this rationality is only getting us so far. And so I got stuck kind of at the rational model. And in the room, I would notice that something would happen every now and again. People would be really, really angry. And then there would be a transformative moment in the room. Somebody would say something nice about somebody else, or somebody would ask a question of somebody else. And that suddenly became contagious, and the whole feeling in the room changed really dramatically. How many people have been in rooms like that? Okay, a lot of people. A lot of people are raising their, nodding their heads. And so the question I had then is, where do you learn about stuff like that? Nobody taught me about the transformative moment, right? There was something, it was a powerful, like a ripple effect in the room where suddenly everybody got something different. So in our lives, where do we learn about these transformative moments? Where do we experience them? Where's our parents in the room? Yeah, they're nodding. Yeah, right? That moment was like, oh my gosh, they're looking at you. It's like, yeah, I don't care about your PhD and your pubs. It's like, feed me, right? Yeah, sorry I just pooped on you. Feed me, right? It's like you're not the, and it is a moment where your whole worldview suddenly shifts. Or God forbid somebody gets sick or somebody close to you dies. Your whole worldview changes. You go home, I'm going to exercise more, I'm going to spend more time with my family. Well, these aren't models that we can bring into a negotiation room. I'm not going to ask the people I'm facilitating to give birth or to have heart attacks. So I was really struggling with this idea of who knows anything about this stuff. And I would work, a lot of times I do these workshops and these trainings, and I was doing one at the World Bank. A sweet, sweet guy there who he was really high up in the water world, but I didn't know at the time. Also a deeply devout Baha'i, practicing Baha'i in his faith. And I would notice that when I'm doing my workshops, I would show this map with the boundaries here, and then I would take the boundaries off the map. And I do that in negotiations. Take the boundaries off the California map or the US map or the Nile map, and all of a sudden people would be jolted like this, like, whoa, where am I? Right? Because you need your boundaries to feel comfortable and to know where you are. And I said, why is it, I'm thinking this problem of transformation and these maps seem to do something. He said, you know what? What these maps seem to be an analog for is the process of spiritual transformation. People start, all the faith traditions of the world have the same goal. You start with your boundaries, with the things I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, whatever it is. Take the boundaries off the map, and suddenly you see more broadly the relationship to each other, the relationship, if this is your language, of the divine. Now I want to go back to this kind introduction that I was given. Notice, professor of geography, earth, ocean, atmospheric sciences. He said this. I freaked out. It's like, no, we don't talk about this stuff. What are you kidding me? Give me something I can model. Give me something that I can cite. I can't cite spirituality. It freaked me out on so many different levels. But As a scientist, you go where the evidence goes. And I kept seeing this moment over and over and over in the facilitation room. And he said something, changed the entire course of the next 8 years of my research. He said, why don't you go find out from different faith traditions how they understand things like conflict and anger and what they do about it, and see if there aren't tools and techniques and worldviews that might be brought into our facilitation room. Why not? I had tenure. They couldn't fire me for asking the question. I had a sabbatical coming up. And so we actually did, Peter Glick of the Pacific Institute, a number of you know his work, and I and the Vatican Science Council. How many people knew the Vatican had a science council? Like, what? Seriously? No, seriously. The Vatican, you guys, it's a secret I know, had a problem once upon a time. A guy named Galileo had some issues with science. Vatican Science Council follows the world's scientific findings and looks to see if there's any conflict between the teachings of the Catholic Church and the findings of science. And if there is, it's the teachings of the Church that has to change. That's what the Vatican Science Council does. So they co-sponsored this meeting where we brought together people who had negotiated water agreements at a very high level and leaders of spiritual traditions from around the world. And we tried to figure out these answers. How do faith traditions understand conflict, anger, forgiveness, reconciliation? What processes are used to transform conflict? How does a spiritual understanding of water impact dialogue? It was held at Vatican City. Anybody been to the Vatican? Anybody been to this part of the Vatican, the closed-off part of the Vatican? Couple. I know. Sarush has. Anybody else? It's really cool. So you go. So this is the Saint. One of the saints, hostels. And when you have a key, right, you're out with 1,000 tourists, and you walk in and you flash your key at these Swiss guards, and they do that. We're not the Pope, but they do that. They pull their halyard, is that what it's called? The pikey, swordy thing. They pull it up and they salute you. It's seriously cool. So, right, right. So anyway, so this is where the meeting is. And these guys, we have 3 days, and it is a profound disaster in terms of dialogue, right? So you have one guy, he was the water minister of Nepal, and he's talking about dissolved oxygen and hydrofluvial geo something. And next to him, there's like this Sufi mystic that's just like glowing positivity and just smiling. And all you don't know anything except you want to sit next to him, right? You just want that glow to rub off on you. And so they didn't speak at all the same languages. And I realized, at least in the West, and this is what I'm going to come back to, I know as soon as I said the word spirituality, I see it from here, about half of you jump, and half of you cringe. In the West, we're really not used to talking about this. And that's purely a recent phenomenon in a very specific geographic location. And so part of why I bring this up is I think there are really valuable lessons here, but part of why I bring it up is we got to talk about it. We got to, as good scientists, we have to talk about it. So this is the title of my next book, coming out in the fall, The Spirit of Dialogue, Lessons from Faith Traditions. It's not an academic press. I tried to do this in academies, and the first article I wrote had the word spirituality 28 times, and the editor crossed it all off. He said, can't you use something else? Something a little less jarring. All right. Now I'm going to jar you profoundly. So what did come out of the meetings is that I heard certain themes from different worldviews of the different spiritual leaders around the room. And so this happens to be, I'm a geographer, we'll map anything. This happens to be a map of God's consciousness. Okay, don't worry about it. But this is a Kabbalistic view of how the universe works, which is also our internal map, which is also, according to this understanding, a map of divine consciousness. And there are 10 spheres of understanding, and I want to focus on these 3 and show the kinds of teachings that come out that are useful to us in facilitation and conflict resolution. So these 3 are Deen, which is justice. This is the closed-off us. This is the rationality. These are the things that we can measure. These are the laws. These are the rules. This is us with boundaries. Balancing it is something called chesed, which is mercy, or loving kindness, or the other, or community, or spirituality, right? So you see there's a closed side, an open side, and they sit in balance in something called rachamim. And rachamim is translated as compassion. The root, any Hebrew speakers, Arabic speakers, it's the same thing, Rahman. See it, rachamim? What's the root? Yeah, Rahman, Rahmanas, in Yiddish, Rahmanas. The root is rechem, right? Rahem, which is womb, womb. So if you think about what this is saying, is that a mother gives total loving kindness, all of her life force to her unborn child, only as long as she's healthy herself, right? She has to look after herself in order for this to be viable. So this is the relationship. And so when you think about us, our relationship in the Enlightenment, thinking in terms of this model, for me it was very useful. Why? If you have science and spirituality, rationality and spirituality, you can see this in our biology, right? You've got left brain, right brain, and they sit in the intuition of the heart, right? The same structure. What we did in what we call the Enlightenment was we separated out the worlds of rationality and the worlds of spirituality for very legitimate reasons. There's a lot of good historic reasons why this had to happen. But the result is, in the last 200 years, all of our public discourse is about stuff that we can measure. And somehow we've convinced ourselves that we can measure everything. We can measure love, we can measure intelligence, we can measure values, we can measure cooperation. As long as you can put a number to it, it's okay to talk about in public. This other world, go ahead and have it, but it's private, right? Your own, your Friday, your Saturday, your Sunday community. Go ahead and have this other world in private. Don't bring the two together, right? And so we've been doing this. And again, it's very specific geographic locations. It's only Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, right? And so now we've been doing this for 200 years, thinking that the whole world works like this, that this is the way of the world, that we agree in public on things that we can measure, and everything else is relegated to the private realm. How many people are not from the US originally? How many people have traveled outside of the United States? It's a little different in the rest of the world, right? It's a little different in the rest of the world. And all of our public institutions pretend that it's not. The soldiers coming back from Afghanistan, they're like, they wanted to talk to me about God and my motivation and my religion. I didn't know how to have this conversation, right? Hugely important. Well, now, first of all, the question is this universal enough to be able to tap into? And yes, again, in Arabic, you have Al-Hakam, Al-Rahman, Al-Rahim as the three. If you happen to be Christian, the model is what? You see it, right? Absolutely. The Father of the Old Testament, the Son of the New Testament sitting together in the Holy Spirit, right? We see this in the balance of Taoism, right? I was working with a Buddhist monk who did facilitation in northern Thailand, and I said, does this balance exist in Buddhism? I said, all I know is the concept of metta, of loving kindness, of openness. He said, well, we use this Taoist symbol. I don't know if you've ever seen this before, right? So sitting in balance. Shiva and her third eye, the third eye of Shiva, the eye of intuition, is balanced by the eye of the sun and the eye of the moon. A lot of you are feeling really uncomfortable right now, so I'll give you a graph to hone you in, right? So you think about the Nash equilibrium, right? This guy, so that's the real Nash, and that's the film version. What's the Nash equilibrium? It's basically this. It's basically saying we thought economics was all of us pursuing our own self-interest, but it turns out not to be. It turns out that we find a balance, what we call the Nash equilibrium, between our own self-interest and the interest of the group. Right? So he wins the Nobel Prize in economics for something that all of our faith traditions have been teaching for thousands of years. Right? Okay, so you've had your graph. We can get back to the rest of this stuff. So what does this mean for us in terms of practice? Right? This is all very beautiful. Oh, and at this point we're all Californians. We go, oh, yeah, woo-woo, it's lovey. But it's practical. Right? Because when we think about justice, when we think about how we resolve conflicts, in our, quote, enlightened West, we focus on justice. Somebody does something wrong, you lock them up, you throw away the key. Longer the better. Even better, put them to death to dissuade other people from doing the same kinds of things. Right? We don't think about this in a concept of balance. And this is the root of what we call alternative dispute resolution here, recognizing the limitations of this model, focusing on justice. In a lot of the rest of the world, there's a balance in the process. So this is from the Muslim world, the process of sulh. Somebody does something wrong, they come to the person, the perpetrator comes to the community under a white flag with the leaders, village leaders with them, comes and asks the family for forgiveness, right? Recognizing that the crime is not just about the criminal, it's about the community. The criminal took power away from the family and gives it back symbolically and says, will you allow me to be reconciled within the community? The crime is a rent in the fabric that now needs to be, resolved. And there are two aspects of it, not just the rights of everybody involved, but the concept of honor, the concept that this is a community issue. And there's this wonderful concept, taratin, resolution of a conflict that involves no humiliation. Right? That's a powerful, powerful concept, and it's worldwide. This at the village scale, at the local scale, this happens absolutely everywhere. And the problem is we have these processes at the local scale, and then at the national scale, there's a lot of Western law, but our problems now are precisely in between those two scales, where we don't have a language. We can't use this and we can't use that, and so we're stuck trying to figure out a balance. In places like Singapore, they're trying to revive this idea at the national level, what they call the kampung spirit, the kindness movement. They're trying to bring it into neighbor-to-neighbor dialogue, and they have these community mediation centers where they're able to resolve on these bases that something that happens wrong is a community issue all over the world. I'm going to take you deeper into this model. The same model offers what's called the four worlds in Kabbalistic thinking, the four worlds. And starting from the foundation, if you think for just a second, I was going to say close your eyes, but you guys probably drift off at this stage. But think for a minute. Think with me for a minute. I wonder if I can do this. Picture, how many people have had a difficult conversation recently? Maybe since January 20th. Right? Okay, most of us had. Now think about the very first moments of that conversation. Okay? Think about what happens in your body when you start to have a conversation, start to talk with somebody with whom you viscerally disagree. What's the first thing that happens in your body? Where do you feel it? Right? Right in here, right? Some real discomfort right in here. And you keep talking to people, you keep talking, then what happens? What's the next stage? As you continue to talk, what happens? Say again? Comes up, and what do you start to feel? Anger, what else? Frustration, dismissal, defense. And those are all the same things, by the way. Anger, fear, right? Sorry? Anxiety. So all these is our emotional life, right? And what we learned later is this idea that anger is a shield protecting our vulnerability. So let's keep going. You have this physical response, you have an emotional response, then what starts to happen? Anybody ever be talking to somebody they really, really disagree with and suddenly go, huh, that's an interesting point? No. No. You said yes, right? From time to time, you kind of look and go, huh, that's interesting. That's kind of interesting. And then finally, the next stage is what? That's kind of up here around your head. That's what we call the perceptual level. And then what? Sorry? You start listening, right? You start connecting, you start sharing, right? Well, it turns out that these four levels, these four worlds, turn out to be fairly universal. What we just did in a conflict is what happens at lots of different scales. You start at the physical level, and it's a physical manifestation. It's really, really uncomfortable. And we have a tendency to let that lead us then, right? The way the model works is that well, I'll show you in just a second. Physical level, then the emotional level. And here's where that discomfort's starting to come up. And it's so discomfort. And that's when we start lashing out. We start screaming back, you don't know. And then you can actually train yourself to move up here. Because you notice when you're up in here, it doesn't hurt quite so bad. And you can train yourself to do that by asking yourself one simple question. What can I learn in this moment? What can I learn from this experience? So when you're here, you desperately want to argue back, fight back. How many people have ever been persuaded of something by somebody screaming at them? No, you have not. Put your hand down. Seriously? But forced. Yeah. That's not persuaded, right? Now, how many people have really found themselves in deeply engaging conversations where they've learned something with people they really disagree with, right? So here's the interesting thing. Not just our country, every representative democracy in the world is split 50-50, right? 50 on the kind of lefty side of the spectrum, 50 on the kind of righty side of the spectrum, which kind of leads us in a conundrum. Either half the world, the half that doesn't agree with me, either half the world is wrong or stupid or brainwashed or any of a number of things, or, and here's the scary thing, or maybe there's at least two different ways to see the world. Right? And so if we're going to figure out how to do this, we got to learn how to listen and how to learn. And that's the question that brings you up here. What can I learn in this moment? And that takes you from, I got to force something down their throat to, okay, I'm going to listen here. Because what will happen if you listen long enough? What do they then do for you? They'll listen to you. They'll listen to you, right? That anger gets dissipated when it's met with open, transformative, honest listening from the heart, right? Now, if you want to move up, and this language is comfortable for you, I know the language is not comfortable for everybody, but if you want to go up even deeper, the next question is, what do I share with this person, right? What can I learn here gets you up here in the head. What do I share with this person? No matter who they are, you share something, right? Whatever language is comfortable for you, the light of the divine, our shared space on this planet, or whatever it is, right? Don't use language that's not comfortable to you, because that's not the point. The point is not the language. But no matter what situation you're in, no matter who, now you got to be safe, obviously. I always get asked, what about the horrible people? You have to be safe to do any of this stuff, right? Okay, so these 4 levels, the question is, one, remember water? So when we talk about water, there's a lot of different waters, right? There's physical water, the water we need for survival. There's emotional water, the water that represents, here's our 4 levels. Anybody recognize them from anywhere, by the way, besides the Kabbalah? These 4 levels, anybody recognize them? Say again? A wellness wheel? Really nice. From where? From which tradition? Yeah, indigenous, tribal. Yep, absolutely. Where else? Anybody else recognize them? Yeah. Pyramid of needs. Whose needs? Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Most people go to this. And so if you're wondering, like when you walk out of here, can you use any of this in the real world? If you use Maslow, you're okay. You don't have to use the word spirituality because people freak out. But you can use Maslow, right? So Maslow had this hierarchy of needs for physiological. There's a new version, by the way, for the new millennium. It's kind of right. So it turns out Maslow, anybody know what tradition he came from? What his faith roots are? Yeah, it's Jewish, right? He's Jewish. So in Jewish tradition, those 4 worlds, first were when Moses went through them as he climbed Mount Sinai. And then the temple in Jerusalem was structured as a guided meditation through the 4 worlds, from the outer to the inner. And in the Holy of Holies, there's actually nothing was there. Except the Spirit. And then in the Jewish prayer book now, it's the prayers that Jews say 3 times a day is basically the same meditation through those 4 worlds. And so Maslow, he stole it basically from God. The same structure, anybody been to Angkor Wat? Angkor Wat was originally a Hindu structure, now is a Buddhist shrine, and the same thing, 3 levels up, and then nothingness represented by an orange robe at the top. Vishnu's 4 totems, look at the mace, right? The mace, which is physical strength. The lotus flower, this is a glory of existence. The discus, which is the mind chakra. And the conch, the sound of the om, the universal sound of oneness. In Islam, this is a Sufi understanding, Sharia. of different kinds of sharias. There's tarika, which is, the physical is the law, sharia. The emotional is tarika, which is prayer of the heart. Hakika is the perceptual, which is the truth. And marifa is attunement. This is what was explained to me that in sharia, what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours. That's the law. In tarika, what's yours is mine, what's mine is yours. In hakika, there is no mine and there is no yours. And in marifa, there is no me and there is no you. Right? So you notice how we move, the distinctions between us start to dissipate at these different levels. And that's true of each of the different structures. So again, come back to water. You've got physical water that you can't. People talk about water. It's either a human right or it's an economic good. And the idea is that it's both. It depends on water for what. Water for survival, water for spiritual needs. You're not going to put a market value on that. That's water as a human right. And again, those of you who are Catholic, the Pope just affirmed that 3 days ago in Vatican City. You have water, this transportation. I love this. Somebody came up with slides for me. I said, find me a slide for transportation, water for transportation. Right? So hydropower, now you're starting to it's a different water, right? It's either emotional, you want the dam for whatever reason, or it's intellectual, that this is, you talk about benefit cost analysis. And irrigation, it depends. If it's subsistence irrigation, that's water that's critical for survival. If it's industrial agriculture, then yeah, you're going to put a market value on it and you're going to charge for it just like any other input. Spiritual water, it's got to be absolutely fundamental. And so the water, when it's jarring, is in negotiations where, for example, in the Southwest, when the Hopi were asked to give water from their sacred spring to transport coal slurry, that's jarring. That's spiritual water and physical water coming together in a really ugly way. I was at a meeting where I was explaining something like this, and again, a lot of people get really upset about the constructs, and I say, why is this spiritual water? What's this mean? It's just out of curiosity. What's your faith? I'm Catholic. So if you had your toilet was clogged in the church, would you use the water from the front, the holy water, to unclog the toilets? No, right? So we get it, right? We get it, and yet we need to understand as we move out at what different levels these are jarring. And then it gives us languages to talk about each of the different sets of water and meet the different sets of needs. It gives us a hint for who might be in the room. A lot of times at the physical level, we talk about practitioners, policy makers, development partners. At the kind of emotional level, the free enterprise of private enterprise sometimes is in the room. Academia is almost never invited in, although they ought to be. And certainly the spiritual community is not in the room when we're making water decisions. They absolutely have to be. This is what motivates most of the world for all the things that they're doing. And we're missing values. Again, at the village level, if you're trying to get a message out or to receive a message about water, you either have these guys out there doing it, or this is usually who we end up sending, right? And so there's this huge disconnect when we go out. And I'll give some examples. In a lot of Asia, the Buddha, it turns out, resolved a water dispute. How many people know that? Stopped the water war. Okay? One social scientist, thank you. Yeah, Buddha, number of people were about to fight. He went to the princess. He says, what's the argument about? So we don't know. He went down and down and down, finally to the peasants. They said, it's about water. We're sharing the water. The other village took the water. He went back to the princess. He said, is the water more valuable than the blood which is about to be spilled? And stopped the war simply with the question. In the Nile, the Copts had been asked. Things got a little ugly after this. But again, who carries the message? Who has good offices to invite people in? A lot of times, I know it's jarring for Westerners, but in the Middle East, I've been in the room where a priest, an imam, and a rabbi have all started us off with prayers, and it elevates the conversation. Where are you going to have your meeting? 9 times out of 10, my facilitations are in ugly windowless rooms where there's all kinds of other places that elevate us, elevate the spirit, and elevate. This is how I see the world. This is the only human manifestations here are universities, right? So this is my kind of worldview. This is the Columbia Basin, and in the Columbia we're negotiating with Canada, and this is the kind of language that comes out on the U.S. Side. They said we're facilitating shared water resources to maximize benefits. This is something you can measure. Same on the Canadian side, maximize benefits to both countries. This is how we're thinking about water within the basin. Who else is in the basin besides U.S. and Canada? Thank you very much. 15 tribes, recognized tribes and reservations on the U.S. side. Another whole group of indigenous people, the First Nations on the Canadian side, and here's the spirit wheel, right? The same understanding of the four worlds. And you're like, how do you have this conversation when the core is saying these are the benefits that you should measure? I was in a room on the Nile Basin where they were talking about sharing benefits, and a woman from Ethiopia, one of the local NGOs, she said, wait a second, just so I get this right, we weren't an international basin until you guys drew all those nice straight lines from the safety of Germany, and now we're an international basin, and now instead of sharing things the way we've always been doing, because it's an international basin, we have to quantify the benefits according to the things that you think are important that ignore all the things that are important to us, like our spirituality, like our community, like our villages, like our relationships to each other and to the divine. Is that about right? Well, the World Bank is kind of stymied. Well, yeah, kind of, right? So there's other ways to do it. Like I said, in the Nile, they at least set up, when they tried to negotiate a treaty, they set up what's called a shared vision program, which was local stakeholders, along with their action plan. But again, the shared vision program is all about the things that you can measure, right? Some confidence-building measure, public information, stakeholder involvement, but none of this language. And so you see this over and over. This is really interesting. Anybody from New Zealand? A fascinating way that they brought, so the Maori were actually involved in helping to write this national policy statement. And the language, the Maori understanding is suffused within this policy statement. I'll just read this, and I won't try and pronounce the Maori words. All things in the natural world have life force and a spiritual dimension. Respect for the spiritual integrity of the environment and God that created it will ensure that the treasure can be protected and passed on to succeeding generations. This is a modern Western country recognizing these values that suffuse not just the Maori, but also the Westerners that live there. We've done this for 200 years. We've closed our eyes to this world, and it's to our detriment. Unless we get better at using this kind of language and remembering these understandings that we have, we're going to continue to go down the route that we have. This is a map of water aid coming primarily from the post-Enlightenment West out into the rest of the world. And with this aid comes this Western understanding. These are the metrics of success. These are the things that are benefits. These are the things that we call intangibles. And oftentimes they're precisely the things that are of most value to a lot of the people that we're dealing with. And we've done this for so long we don't even know we're doing it. I want to end with this. I know, again, I come from a faith that's not the majority faith myself, and I know full well, every time somebody, when I was growing up, every time somebody wanted to talk faith with me, it was to persuade me of something or to convert me to something. And I get all the legitimate reasons we freak out when these concepts come up. But again, one, we're dealing with a lot of the world where that distinction between rationality and spirituality was never made. And two, I think we're reaching a point in our relationship, not just with ourselves and our environment, but with the rest of the world where we have to remember to open up both eyes. So I'm going to end with this quote, recognizing full well that I'm at a public land-grant university, simply demonstrating that we're all connected by water, rich and poor, urban and rural, upstream and down, is a fine place to start, and I think the Holy Spirit will take care of the rest. Thank you very much.